The warning rune on the heavy blast door turned from amber to a screaming crimson, signalling the breach was seconds away. Inside the ruins of the ancient sanctuary, Jax Ryker checked the charge on his scavenged pulse rifle, the weapon feeling heavy in hands that were slick with blood and sweat. A jagged plasma burn across his left shoulder hissed and smoked in the damp air, sending white-hot spikes of agony down his spine with every heartbeat, but he didn't flinch. He couldn't. Anchored to his right leg were the two most valuable beings in the entire Andromeda sector, the twin heirs to the Vraxi throne. Their obsidian skin, usually shimmering with bioluminescent vitality, was dull grey with terror, and their large crystalline eyes were wide, reflecting the sparks raining from the buckling door. Jax looked down at them, his scarred face softening for a fraction of a second. "Bastion!" he grunted to the massive, battle-scarred cyber-mastiff growling low at his side. "Protocol 0. Nobody touches the kids." The dog's mechanical servos whined as it locked its jaw hydraulics. The blast door didn't just open, it disintegrated inward in a shower of molten metal. The traitor's death squad poured in, silhouettes of death against the jungle light. Jax didn't wait to negotiate. He stepped in front of the children, effectively becoming a human shield, and roared a challenge that shook the dust from the ceiling. To understand why a disgraced human commander was willing to die for alien royalty, you have to understand the hell he lived in. Xylos Prime was a Category 5, Death World, a planet where the flora was poisonous, the fauna was carnivorous, and the atmosphere itself tried to dissolve your lungs if you breathed too deep. For Jax Ryker it was perfect. Exiled from the Terran Vanguard for refusing to fire on a civilian transport during the rebellions, he had sought the one place where politics couldn't reach him. His life was a brutal, simple loop of survival. He lived in a reinforced terraforming bunker, spending his days repairing the atmospheric scrubbers and patrolling the perimeter with Bastion. The cyber mastiff was a relic like him, discarded military tech, repaired with scrap metal and stubbornness. They were two ghosts haunting a graveyard world, content to be forgotten by a galaxy that had used them up and thrown them away. The solitude that Jax had carefully cultivated shattered on a Tuesday morning, heralded not by a knock at the door, but by a sonic boom that cracked the canopy of the violet jungle. Jax stood on the roof of his bunker, his optical binoculars tracking a streak of gold and fire tearing through the upper atmosphere. It wasn't a meteor, it was a Royal Vraxi transport, its golden hull screaming of wealth and targetability, spiralling violently out of control. It smashed into the earth 10 miles into the dead zone, a sector of the jungle even the apex predators avoided. His military comms unit, silent for 3 years, crackled with a desperate, automated distress beacon before cutting out. The smart play was to stay put. The logical play was to let the planet claim its due. But Jax looked at Bastion, who was already sniffing the air, ears perked. "Yeah, I know," Jax muttered, racking the slide on his rifle. "We're idiots." He didn't just walk, he geared up for war, stepping out of his sanctuary and into the nightmare green. The crash site was a slaughterhouse. By the time Jax arrived, the jungle's scavengers, six-legged, chitinous horrors, had already picked the fuselage clean of the royal guards. The smell of ozone and copper hung heavy in the humid air. Jax moved through the historic wreckage with the silent grace of a predator, Bastion flanking him. There were no survivors, at least that's what he thought, until Bastion froze near a twisted piece of landing gear and let out a soft whine. Buried beneath a thermal blanket, hidden in the mud, were two small figures, Elara and Kaelin. They couldn't have been more than 6 cycles old. When Jax lifted the debris, they screamed, a high-pitched harmonic sound, and scrambled back. They had been raised on propaganda that humans were mindless, violent ogres. Jax didn't shout. He knelt, holstering his weapon, and held out a hand that was covered in scars, but steady as a rock. He offered them a ration bar, the packaging crinkling in the silence. Elara, the bolder of the two, reached out, her tiny, cool fingers brushing against his calloused palm. It was a moment of pure connection, but just as her fingers closed around the food, Jax's wrist scanner screamed a proximity warning. They weren't just lost, they were being hunted by something that even the monsters of this planet feared, and it was closing in fast. The trek back to Jax's bunker wasn't a walk, it was a running battle against the planet itself. The Vraxi children were not built for this environment. Their physiology was delicate, adapted to the sterile, gravity-controlled environments of the Imperial Palace, not the muddy, root-choked floor of a death world. Jax had to hoist Kaelin onto his shoulders, her small arms wrapping tightly around his neck, while Ilara clung to Bastion's harness. The cyber mastiff, usually a machine of war, moved with surprising gentleness, acting as a stabilizer for the exhausted child. Every 100 meters, Jax had to pause, using his machete to hack through vines that secreted neurotoxins. At one point, a viper drake dropped from the canopy, a reptile the size of a hovercar. Before the children could even scream, Jax had pivoted, driven his blade through the beast's sensory cluster, and kicked the carcass into the underbrush. He didn't boast, he didn't slow down, he just checked the girls for injuries and kept moving. To the princesses, who had only known guards that stood ceremonially still, this human was a terrifying force of nature. But he was their force of nature. Nightfall on Xylos Prime brought a lethal drop in temperature. The violet moss of the jungle floor began to glow with phantasmal light, but the heat vanished instantly. The cold-blooded Vraxi children began to enter thermal shock, their movements becoming sluggish, their bioluminescence fading to a dull, dying pulse. Jax found a small cavern and sealed the entrance with a thermal tarp. He ignited a smokeless chemical fire, but it wasn't enough. The girls were shivering violently, their teeth chattering. Without hesitation, Jax sat against the cave wall and unsealed his heavy tactical vest. "Come here," he commanded gently. Hesitantly, the two princesses crawled into his lap. He wrapped his massive thermal cloak around all three of them, essentially turning himself into a human furnace. For hours he sat awake, listening to their breathing stabilize. Ilara looked up at him, tracing a jagged white scar on his jawline. "Did a monster do this?" she whispered. Jax looked down, his eyes sad. "No, little one. A man did." In that cave, huddled against the chest of the species they were taught to fear, the heirs to the Empire fell asleep feeling safer than they ever had in their golden cribs. They reached the extraction point at dawn, exhausted, covered in mud, but alive. The clearing near Jax's bunker was meant to be their salvation, but as they broke the tree line, the sky turned black. Not from clouds, but from ships. A squadron of Imperial gunships descended, their thrusters flattening the grass. Jax didn't cheer. His combat instincts flared like a supernova. The ships weren't flying the rescue colours, they were flying the colours of the Royal Inquisition. A woman stepped off the lead ramp. Empress Lyra. She looked imperious, frantic, and deadly. But behind her, flanking the perimeter, were soldiers in black armour that Jax recognised from his mercenary days. These weren't rescuers, they were cleaners. The Empress saw her daughters and broke protocol, running toward them. But as the girls rushed to their mother, Jax didn't lower his rifle. He saw the way the soldiers in the back were positioning themselves, not to secure the area, but to create a kill box. The Empress hugged her children, looking at Jax with a mixture of overwhelming relief and confusion. But Jax caught her eye and subtly shook his head, signalling the threat behind her. The trap had been sprung, and they had walked right into the centre of the kill zone. The betrayal was swift and absolute. As soon as the Empress had her children in her arms, the black-armoured soldiers raised their weapons, aiming not at Jax, but at the Empress herself. General Vrak, a tall, spindly Vraxi with cruel eyes, stepped down from the shuttle, slow clapping. "A touching reunion," he sneered, his voice amplified by the ship's speakers. Tragic that the human savage went mad and slaughtered the royal family moments after rescue. It was a coup. Vrak had sabotaged the transport to kill the heirs, and now he had the perfect scapegoat to kill the queen and take the throne. The Empress stood up, her body glowing with psionic energy, shielding her daughters, but she was drained from the worry and the journey. "Stand down, Vrak," she commanded, her voice trembling with rage. The general just laughed. "Kill them all," he ordered. "Leave the human's body for the cameras." The air exploded. Jax moved before the first trigger was pulled. He didn't run away. He ran at them. He pulled the pin on a flashbang grenade and bowled it under the general's feet. The explosion of light and sound blinded the Vraxi, whose eyes were sensitive to light changes. In the chaos, Bastion launched himself like a missile, his metal jaws locking onto the arm of a heavy gunner, tearing through plasteel armour like wet paper. Jax slid across the mud, firing his pulse rifle with surgical precision, 2 shots, 2 down. He wasn't fighting like a soldier. He was fighting like a father protecting his pack. A plasma bolt caught him in the chest plate, cracking a rib and knocking the wind out of him, but he used the momentum to roll and come up with his combat knife. The Empress joined the fray, using her telekinesis to rip the weapons from the soldiers' hands, but there were too many of them. The climax came when General Vrak, recovering from the flash blindness, aimed a disruptor cannon directly at the huddled children. Jax was too far away to tackle him. He had one option. He threw his empty rifle at the general's head, a distraction, and sprinted into the line of fire. The disruptor beam hit Jax squarely in the back, burning through his armour and searing flesh. He screamed, a sound of raw agony, but he didn't fall. He stood there, a smoking, human wall between the executioner and the children. The sight of the human sacrificing himself snapped something in the Empress. Her eyes went pure white. With a scream of primal fury, she unleashed a wave of psionic energy so powerful it didn't just knock the general back, it shattered the landing struts of the shuttle behind him. Bastion finished the job, pinning the traitor to the ground. As the dust settled, the remaining loyalist guards turned on the mercenaries. The battle was won. But Jax Ryker lay face down in the dirt, the smell of burnt flesh rising from his back, as two little girls and an Empress wept over his still form. Consciousness returned to Jax slowly, floating in a suspension of warm, golden gel. He wasn't in a prison cell or a grave. He was in a royal regeneration tank. As the fluid drained and the cost glass slid open, he gasped, clutching his chest. The skin was pink and new, the scar tissue intricate but healed. He stumbled out, draped in a silk robe that had been left for him. Waiting in the chamber was Empress Lyra. She wasn't wearing her crown or her armour. She looked tired, vulnerable, and deeply alien. She approached him, not as a monarch, but as a woman who had almost lost everything. "Why?" she asked softly. "My people have hunted yours. We exiled you. Why did you bleed for us?" Jax leaned against the tank, still weak. "Kids are off limits, Your Highness. Doesn't matter what colour their blood is." The Empress stepped closer, placing a cool hand on his chest, right over his beating heart. "By the ancient laws," she whispered, "a life debt has been struck. You saved the bloodline. You are no longer an exile, Jax Ryker. You are kin." Before Jax could process the political implications of being kin to an alien Empress, the doors slid open and two small projectiles launched themselves at his legs. Elara and Kaelin buried their faces in his robe, sobbing with relief. Bastion limped in behind them, one metal leg replaced with a shiny new gold-plated prosthetic, wagging his tail. The formal barriers of the court had completely collapsed. The princesses chattered excitedly, telling him how they had ordered the royal chefs to make human burgers, which turned out to be terrible, but the thought counted, and how they refused to sleep unless Bastion was in the room. Jax looked at the Empress, expecting her to reprimand them. Instead, she was smiling. A genuine, warm smile that reached her crystalline eyes. "They refuse to let you leave," she said simply. "And I find that I do not wish you to leave either." The final scene shows the grand balcony of the palace, overlooking a city that merged technology and nature. Jax stood there, not in his battered combat gear, but in the formal uniform of the Lord Protector, black and gold. But he hadn't lost himself. His old dog tag still hung around his neck, clinking against the royal armour. Bastion sat proudly at his side, looking like a golden statue. The Empress stood next to him, their shoulders brushing, a scandalous display of intimacy for the court, but no one dared say a word. The two princesses played near the railing, safe. Jax looked out at the stars, realising that for the first time in 10 years he didn't want to be anywhere else. He had found his mission, he had found his pack, and God help anyone who tried to hurt them now. They called him a savage, a brute, and an exile. But to the three most powerful women in the galaxy, he was simply Dad.